knowing that they're working within a 90-day window, talking about negotiating trade deals, bespoke trade deals, to use their words, with dozens of trading partners. Having been at some of these kinds of tables before yourself, how realistic do you think the time frame they're working in actually is to achieving their goals?
It is an opportunity for us to step back from the breach. And when we're talking about this 90-day reprieve, it's important to note we're talking about essentially those other countries other than China. Now, having been at the negotiating table, that is virtually impossible to get that done with 15, 16 different partners. But more importantly, the allure of these negotiations perhaps gives the administration the cover that they need to take a step back and right a wrong that they singularly created. And if the negotiations do nothing else but give them an exit ramp to a more thoughtful policy, a more reasonable approach, then that is something we should try to feed into.
But would taking an exit ramp, Ambassador, make this administration lose credibility on the issue of trade when it comes to these partners? I just wonder if they have the space to do that, if they still want to retain leverage in these conversations.
Well, the one thing you have to admire about this president, he will declare victory for anything. And once he decides, oh, they've all come crawling back and they begged me. I think at this point, America's farmers, America's consumers, America's small businesses who are caught up in this mess, frankly, don't care what the environment has to be. We just need relief for this, because at the end of the day, it is American businesses, consumers, families, manufacturers that are paying the burden of this senseless trade war.
Well, of course, the president argues that he's trying to protect those very same people with these policies who he thinks have been beholden to unfair trade practices and getting ripped off by other countries like China for some time now. And I wonder, Ambassador, and you kind of alluded to this in your first answer, this notion that China is kind of separate to all of these other conversations. If you think it is a realistic proposition for the U.S. to get other countries it's negotiating with to band together with the U.S. in order to combat China, because our reporting indicates that's one of the objectives of the administration here.
Well, that should have been the objective all along, and it has been part of our traditional approach to how we've contained and dealt with China. We've done it in concert with our longstanding allies and trade partners, from Mexico and Canada to Europe, and our partners in other parts of Asia. But because this administration has been so heavy-handed and almost singularly done everything they can to destroy those partnerships, you know, it's hard to kind of bludgeon somebody and then say, well, let me help you up off the ground. Now we're going to go fight the big bully. And that's what's giving so many of us concern, is not only the senselessness and the arbitrariness of these tariffs, it's the destruction that it is doing to many of our long-term relationships. And not just in trade, but in NATO, in security, and in every other venue. For the first time, most of the world questions whether or not they can take the United States of America at our word.
So is there just a great chance then that other countries get together with China and start resisting the policies of the U.S. than that it works the opposite way that the administration might intend it to?
That, you know, that is a challenge, Kailey, but the reality is one of the greatest harms this administration is doing is to the reality the world wants to do business with America. Made in America is still one of the most treasured brands in the world, not only because of our ingenuity, the advancement of our products, but because of the rule of law. And other countries would much rather have access to our enormous market, but also because of our principles, than be forced to deal with China. But if we leave them in a corner, we shove them all aside, then they are going to have to rethink that proposition.
Well, and of course, there's also the consideration of not just the tariffs that are being placed on individual countries or this global baseline, but sectoral tariffs as well. We have seen just in the last 2 days, Ambassador, the formal opening of Section 232 investigations into things like semiconductors, now critical minerals. And I wonder what you make of those kind of efforts that are supposed to be looking specifically at national security, and if you think those actually may have more merit.
Well, I don't know that they'll have more merit, because the one thing, Kailey, that makes this so troubling, all these tariffs are piled on top of previous tariffs. The administration imposed steel and aluminum tariffs, the first Trump administration, the 10% baseline there, the 20% levy is there. And at a time that you're trying to encourage manufacturing to come back to America, and particularly in the chip sector, is this the time to spark a trade war with the one country that many of these companies are dependent on for the raw materials? So that's a decision the administration has to make. But I think there has to be a step back and look realistically at how do we continue to grow our economy? How do we have access to the inputs that we need to be able to do that? And what's the most thoughtful way to go forward? And let me just add one other thing, because lost in this is the notion that all inputs are bad. And the reality, whether it's agriculture or manufacturing, much of what we make in this country, we need to source materials from other countries. So imposing a tax on that only makes the cost of producing those goods more difficult.
And what about the legal justifications you use to impose that tax, Ambassador? I mentioned the Section 232 reviews would be a different kind of tariff authority the president is using, but we've also seen him use IEEPA, declaring an economic emergency to enact tariffs on trading partners. Gavin Newsom of California is now suing, saying that's a misuse of that authority. And I wonder if you do think that legal standing is murky.
Well, it has never been used before, and one of the frustrations that you're hearing from American businesses almost across the board, particularly our exporters, is that IEEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Act, has never been used before to levy tariffs. It's traditionally used to levy sanctions, and there are a number of legal challenges, not just from the state of California, but other businesses challenging this statute in particular, because of the fact that on one hand, the statute makes it clear if the national emergency is, say, fentanyl in this case, the remedy should be related to that. And traditionally, tariffs haven't been used for that. The other frustration is there are no recourse available for our businesses under IEEPA as there is under Section 232 or under Section 301.
And finally, Ambassador, as we look ahead to what's happening tomorrow, a visit from the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni to the White House to discuss trade with President Trump. From what you've seen, how steep of an uphill climb is it for the European Union to reach some kind of accord with the U.S., knowing the administration has said it's not just about tariffs, but what they describe as a big basket of non-tariff barriers?
You know, I'm having as much difficulty as a lot of people trying to divine what this administration's goal is and what will make it happy. Sadly, one thing we know is this president loves to have everyone come and at least presumptively bend the knee, pay homage to him. And if you do that, then you get maybe a little better deal than you might not otherwise. But the European Union is our strongest economic partnership outside of a trade relationship, and has been for years. And so I'm hopeful that the Italian Prime Minister, the heads of the European Union, and others can convey that need for that partnership to President Trump about how we can work together and collectively grow our economies and come up with a more thoughtful approach to how we want to deal with China.